And I think there are some stuff that when you design games are really clicking with more the epistemology of social science. And one of the main thing is your description of the story, of how the story happens. Well, your distinction between how a story can be made by only one person and it tries to impose the story at the table. And the other side is like the story, as you call it, is the story is happening right now. We're not trying to impose the story to the other. Am I understood?
I think so.
Okay. And so the first thing that is clicking is like it's really the big divide in the epistemology of social science between unveiling the laws of social law, unveiling the story that is pre-written, the cultural pre-behavior that exists and people would follow like machine, and constructing the social reality, constructing really the culture in life.
That
It's
is,
very general
no,
for the
that's
moment.
very, very clear. Let's take it back to the 19th century, and then the francophone tradition there is actually probably really important, because that precise controversy of how does science, and that was related to the changes in technology at the time, but it's only related. How does science relate to society? And the framing of that question over the course of the decades for about 100 years was answered very firmly in favor of your first option, that society is a story. Science is going to make this story happen. We are observing scientific, phenomena and understanding contributing to this story. Different people did this, and they say they all disagree with one another, but they all agree on that. So you can look at revolutionary theory, you can look at progressive theory, you can look at conservative and empire theory, and you can look at the business class, the arrival of what then was called liberalism, but today we would think of, some people would call it bourgeois, others would call it, well, a lot of words, but effectively entrepreneurial power. So all of them disagreed with one another about what they wanted, but they all agreed that society was a story. The very words Western civilization carry that story in it. It's full of mythology, but it is a very important story to people. It's hard to find outlooks, whether philosophical or even just implicit. It's hard to find them when they don't presume that society is a story. And you can see this in miniature in psychology as well. Is a person's life supposed to be a story? And so if you say, no, that is very offensive and frightening to people a lot of the time. And so and you can see people in all these cases, whether political, social, or psychological, if you say that life as it happens, society as it happens, is not a story, they will claim that you have no intrinsic morality and no possible goal. Morality and goals are presumed to be synonymous with the word story in a very unreflective way. It's very common. Does this make any sense?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So this is a pretty big debate. I mean, this is not something that is solved. I mean, I could look at me. I'm drinking my coffee. I am surrounded by books which probably would not impress anybody in any academic department. I have, this opinion, but I'm completely marginal. There's no way that the statement that let's study history, but let's abandon the idea that it's a story. Even the people who say that have a really hard time actually doing it. So when we talk about sitting at a role-playing table, I only have one piece of data to use on my power for this idea. Only one piece of data, which is that if somebody wrote a story, in fact, I will let somebody pick an example. Find a person in history who actually produced a story. You might find one or two examples in history. I'm kidding, of course. There are millions, infinite examples. Somebody makes a story. Fiction. What was there before? What was there before the story began? What processes were involved? And it necessarily needs a medium. It necessarily needs to have some way that it is transmitted to other people. So I am arguing that at least potentially the circumstances of role-playing can be in that situation. And you see, history, of course, you can't say what was there before there was history. Either it's irrelevant, there weren't any humans, so who cares? Mm-hmm. Or it's considered ineffable. You can't imagine it. Before the Big Bang of the universe, you cannot imagine. Or philosophically, where was yourself before you were you? And then the answer to that is no one knows. Okay. So here, when we talk about fiction and stories, we have literally the observation that before this, it wasn't there. And after this, it was. The components were always there. Stories concern not too many topics. Infinite applications and observations and reflections and structures, but not too many topics. Especially if you think broadly across living things, it's pretty humanocentric, right? It's clearly we are talking about ourselves to each other. So that's not too hard. So I am saying that all of the material for the story, and we can be historical and add everything about the author's situation, everything about this, all of it, socioeconomic, place in time and space, everything. Sexual history, I don't care, whatever you want, everything about the person. And say, yes, this is going to be contextual for this story. We can take that context, we can take the basic building blocks of human problems that all stories I can think of have. And role-playing has those things. We are collectively in the same situation as that brilliant genius in their room, in their special writing room, where they make their story. And so I'm saying, well, no, we're a bunch of geeks sitting around a table. We're the same. Nothing special. Just like him. Nothing special. Or her. Or they. And it really, collectivity is not very hard to understand either. Because although we love the idea of the single creator, multiple contributors are a fact. The words on a page are often heavily influenced by other participants. And although the mythology is that that is typically negative, there are many cases where, an obvious example, and this is the same for science, an obvious example is when a creator, a named creator, has somebody that they work with very, very closely. They could not get it done without this person. Officially, that person is just an assistant. The classic example for a novelist is the wife who types. But there are many, many others. When it comes to theater and cinema, that's all the more obvious. Auteur theory has always failed. It's a great way to be a fan, is to love your auteurs. But it's no way to understand how a movie is made. So collectivity in this regard is not very difficult. Which leads us to the interesting question, which I mention in my videos. Why don't we just sit around and agree to make up our story? Why don't we just sit down and talk it through? And I'm not talking about making the story so someone else will watch it later. I'm talking about experiencing the story as well. So why can't we do it? And the answer is that I don't think the process of making a story is a matter of agreement even inside someone's own mind. Even inside someone's own minds, they are struggling with options. They are struggling with, well, what if? They are struggling with, no, I don't like that. They're struggling with, that character wouldn't do that. They're struggling with, and then it turns out this way. And when one creates a story, at least in my experience, alone, there is a feeling of rightness and certainty when you finally do reach what you want in there. And it's very famous, it doesn't feel like it's you. It feels external to you in many cases. But that's okay, I don't care how it feels, that's just how it feels. So the psychology of the matter is clearly, or cognition, is clearly almost a dream state where different options are bouncing around in different ways. And I don't care if the writer is making an outline and filling in the outline. I don't care if they write the end first. I don't care if they do it in an opium haze. I don't care. Before that, there were hundreds of options for the ways this story would be structured, or the ways that its plot would go, what the character would do, what would happen. After this process, it is what it is. So I don't think that process internally is a matter of agreement, and therefore my game designs feature almost, if any, consensus among players, among the participants. That's something that's been observed a couple of times, that in many role-playing games, the rules or the text drives toward you must agree, you must agree, you must agree, you must agree. If you can't agree, talk it through, arrive at agreement, arrive at consensus. Make everyone happy. And my designs do not. And it leads to a phrase that is often misunderstood that comes from the Forge. The phrase is, I think, correctly ascribed to Vincent Baker. System is the means by which we arrive at agreement. But that doesn't mean that the best system says, okay, everybody just agree. It doesn't work in reverse.
Yeah.
So does that help a little bit for...
Yeah. Totally. And it totally helps. And it really leads to, well, the following part of my email, obviously. Because I wrote you this email. Well, I read your interview. I sensed, I felt some things like that you confirm right now. And I was telling to you, I read this book about jazz,
Right.
about the jazz repertoire in actions. And it's from really famous sociologist Howard Becker. It's one of the most famous sociologists who has been very known for his studies about norms and deviance, outsiders.
Yes.
The name of the book.
Yes.
And the creation of a not outsider culture.
I'm sitting here with Hebdige in my head while you are talking, so just we will see what happens.
No, it's interesting because the first Howard Becker's book, so Outsiders, it's really about how you have, he calls it norm entrepreneur. Okay. How this entrepreneur creates the subculture. It's not people who have actually practiced that are subcultural. It's like there is somebody who says, who designs them of something that is not of the norm. And this book is based on true fieldwork, marijuana smokers, and jazz players in the 50s. The author himself is a jazz author. So the first book was about that. And the book I'm talking about is really about how the real question, it has been written in the 90s, or maybe like 15 years ago. But all the fieldwork comes from 20 years of fieldwork. And so what their question is, how can you have people like musicians, jazz players who meet every night in all the world and they improvise a set that satisfies everybody, even the musicians themselves, but the given audience too. And so the question is that the first answer seems very simple is that you just know all the songs. And they come together and they just play the songs they know. But on the fieldwork, they realize that
that doesn't happen clearly. Yeah.
No, that doesn't happen. And you mentioned in your interview at one moment that when we think about role-playing sessions, it's more like the process of creation of music, more than any other artistic.
The first reference for that comes from an old edition of RuneQuest.
Oh yeah.
And the authors say that, at least in some applications, role-playing resembles free-form jazz. What they're talking, and they were talking specifically about the lack of the lack of a finished song to begin with. And in some ways it's a little bit romantic because not all free-form performance actually makes a song.
True.
Right. So we keep that in mind. But the point was that the rules text that you were holding was not the model for the product you would make. That's what I'm aiming at. And that was the first role-playing text to actually say that. Very few of them, for years and years, actually managed to take it to the next step of addressing this phenomenon. It was much more popular to say, no, this rule book is the product. Play so you can be like what you are reading.
Yeah,
that's
which is
a completely different product, a completely different process, a completely different activity.
And which is very, very distant from my experience of roleplay. I mean, one of the main I don't know the other culture of roleplay of people who plays roleplaying games, but in our game in our city, like the main tagline is the adventure, so the pre-written adventure. The adventure the GM has in mind. never survives the encounter of the PCs.
Now that can be
And
treated as a virtue, so that the whole
true.
idea of the pre-written adventure or the planned scenario or tonight's session, tonight's episode, that whole idea is just a pretty fiction and just a joke anyway. And then literally, you just say it to be funny, because you know that's not what we are doing. On the other hand, and as I keep saying, as you just said, you're not that familiar with, a considerable portion of the role-playing hobby is predicated on the precise opposite, that cooperation with the leader at the table is the highest virtue, and that to facilitate that plan is good play.
I've heard about that.
Right. But if you look at the role-playing texts, you will find the majority of them support this, particularly during the 1990s, but not only then. And I also, and this is a matter of some intense debate, I also think that any number of games that brand themselves story games have that ideal as well. So it's just as a point of opinion on my part, I think it is a pervasive presence in the hobby. I don't necessarily call it a toxic thing. I don't necessarily call it a problem to be eradicated. What I do say is that that is simply not the same activity as what we are discussing. So
I've always seen this as one of the first skills that you learn as a GM, more than a virtue. Like, you have to learn that your story will not survive the encounter of the people.
Or simply not to make one. That you are in the position in the model we are talking about. The position of anybody, and if we want to say the GM, that's a little tricky because we have to identify the precise tasks in that game that person actually does at the table. But really anybody. But let's say there's somebody who has some centralized authority, some centralized powers, even the responsibility of making up what has already happened, the backstory. That person plays the role of raw material. Let's say I'm sitting down to write a story by myself, and some part of my life experience, some part of my perspective on things, some decisions about what material I am working with, all of those are going to be the first things affecting me. They have to be, otherwise I can't write a story. That's the role of this centralized person, or the collective role if we make up the backstory together, but whatever. The role is, in fact, the distinction of that role from the processes by which we will now make a story is absolutely necessary. And the interesting aspect of this is to think ahead when you are working on the story. Do you or don't you think about the audience responding to it? Ideally, no, you're in a wonderful state of creator spirituality and you would never dream or care of what an audience will think. But in practice, I suspect that there is kind of a fading in and out of other readers. Or perhaps you are projecting yourself into the role of a reader as you create sometimes. Doesn't that sound like the role-playing experience in terms of whether we enjoy our game or not, whether we enjoy what we make? Sounds a lot like it.
A lot. And let me come back a bit to the jazz experience, because we will see the comparison. So
yes, please. Sorry.
No, you're welcome. What strikes me is, like, they say, after all, the set that the jazz band plays on this evening. So they just meet for the first time. That's one of the cases.
Right.
That's one of the situations. So you have people, you have personal experience, and you have situations, and you have songs. That's the four main elements of what's happening in this situation. For the first time, so first it's a negotiation. So you talked about consensus. I think I lost the cam. Okay. You talked about consensus, and you're right, I think, about that. Here it's really about mutual adjustments.
Yes.
And I think that the systems, as you told, the system is the way to help with the mutual adjustments. We all have some, so you talk about a creative shared imaginary space, something like creative space?
I shared imagined space.
Shared imagined space. So
Yeah,
this is our situation. But how do you arrive with a lot of personal different experience of culture to create something that seems to satisfy everybody in this creative space?
Looking at the circumstances in which it doesn't work is very instructive.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's one of the situations that it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And generally, in my experience, it goes bad, like in the relationship. I have one of the few cases where the player refused the situation because of the system. We make a roll, something happens, I describe what happens, and he quits the table.
Yeah, that can happen.
Generally, when it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen in the relationship ever. It's not a matter of the game.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things that are very difficult to pull apart. One of them is when there is an emotional or social goal at work that is not satisfied. This is not satisfying that goal for this person. They will never get to sleep with the guitarist. And the day they decide they will never get to sleep with the guitarist, they stop playing with the band. That's nothing to do with the music particularly, right? But it's very important, and if you look at the music they are making, you will see it informs aspects of the music, certainly. So there's that. Then there's also what I was talking about in some of my earlier work, different large goals, large creative goals. And it's important to validate these goals rather than to dismiss them. So it may be unfamiliar to some people and very familiar to others that you can play a role-playing game in a much more competitive or challenge-based set of goals. And that this is fun. Instead of saying what's not fun is when you don't want to do it and someone else does. It's not fun for anybody. So let's put that aside too. Let's take away the fact that no game system is going to solve either of those problems. You cannot find a system to satisfy those different goals. And the music or the work or the game itself is not going to resolve the romantic tension either. So, therefore, when it doesn't work, when the actual medium of interaction breaks down, the people want to do this, and it doesn't happen when they try. Now, in jazz, what is happening there?
In jazz, as I've read it,
right,
the feeling situation is you impose a song. So it's a process of negotiation. Hey, do you know this song? No, I don't know, but do you know this one? Sometimes when it fails, it's because the leader says, anyway, let's play it. And the failure is you just can't play it. I mean, you make false notes, you can follow it. And that's the big failure in jazz for them. So I think what's interesting is that the process of negotiation itself. I
I
think we can
agree.
see the game as a negotiation, even if we don't really negotiate.
Right,
But in fact, we
right,
are. Hey, but can I do that? No, I think you can. But why?
right.
Because there's this element, and I don't know. It's stupid. I can't do it.
And also the precedence that is set by the negotiations. How do they go in the beginning, and then later when a person continues to use the same logic, and the person might say, no, that's not working, and you say, wait a minute, it worked before.
Mm-hmm.
I was just following the same reasoning you did last time. And the person might say, but no, you misunderstood my reasoning. That's not why I agreed last time. So what you're doing this time isn't going to work. Now, this leads to some topics which are apparently very tough for people. And I suspect that the language for jazz is also difficult. You use the word leader.
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
sometimes I use, in my terminology, I used the words authority.
Mm-hmm.
Both of those have difficult implications, because you do not lead unless they want to go, and you cannot have authority unless it is accepted, and you cannot. Sometimes people say credibility. This person, when he says who did the murder, we are all playing, but this person knows who did the murder in the backstory, and the rest of us do not. We give them credibility, but you see, we have to give it to them. The knowledge being that it's not up for negotiation. He says this person did the murder. And in some games, there is a negotiation about that. In other games, there's not. So those are different ways, system, as I say, ways to arrive at what we will agree about. Sometimes that involves giving power to people that others do not have. But it has to be given. So what is going on in some of these cases when you say, I am the band leader, right? I am the most famous person in the set. My name is on the front of the, playing tonight, right? My name. You guys just showed up. So I'm the leader. So we're going to play this, and you say, well, I don't know that so well. That's okay. Just follow along, do a solo in B. Right? Get ready. Just listen, do a solo in B. Okay, I'll let you know. And this is, as I say, we don't have good language for talking about when it doesn't work. It's easy to find the cases when it's completely dysfunctional, and this guy shot that guy's wife, so of course, they have a big fight in the middle of the set, so much for the music, right? But that's trivial for our purposes, isn't it? That's not a creative discussion. We need to talk about when they both mean it, they both want it. When does the system fail? And that is a really, really interesting question, and has a lot of mystery in it for role-playing. It's way too easy to say, well, that guy just he didn't like us, he has a bad attitude, all these excuses, right? These guys play together, and the audience likes it fine, but you know what? They don't get together to play again like that. This guy's famous, that guy's famous. I'll play with both of them, but they happen never to get together again, and if they did, I wouldn't go. Why? We use words like, well, there's a personality clash. There's an attitude there. There's lack of chemistry. None of these words actually tell us what's really happening. They are phrases that we use to say, don't ask.
And I think that's the jazz comparison is interesting. Becker talks about this repertoire.
Yeah.
There is different repertoire. So the repertoire, in his view, is the practical instance of culture. You don't have a pre-written culture that people follows. You don't have a set of behavior that in specific situation you will activate.
Right.
It's not true. You construct in every situation.
That's an interesting point of view. I can see there's debate about that, but yes, go on. Okay.
Yeah, there's debate.
Yeah.
What's interesting with our topic, specific topic, is we're talking about situations of games. So generally, the scientific debate doesn't apply to our.
That's right. We are making a piece of entertainment or of enjoyment.
So
yeah. The other nice thing about jazz as an analogy is that the performance of a particular piece during a live performance of this kind of jazz is a little bit divorced from product.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you are not going to take... It may become a live recording that people buy later.
No.
Or it may not. Right.
Because people know only partial songs.
Right.
Like, do you know the tempo? Or it's like the tempo of this other song. Let me try this.
Right.
But not only you construct, it's not about the song, it's about all the set.
That's right.
Because you construct the whole set. And Becker speaks about like two repertoire actually. So you have the répertoire de travail. I read the book in French, so it's the working repertoire. It's the one that the band is working with. The band is constructing this repertoire. Then the band will meet again. So they meet once, they don't know each other, then they meet a second time, a third time, and they construct this repertoire of the band. So it's really like a role-playing group.
That's very similar, of course, yes.
But they all came with their own repertoire, that they come from the cultural environment. And I think in role-playing games, what they call the cultural environment is like you hear a song on the radio, you have read a lead sheet, somebody taught you.
You have played this game before, or some other game.
Exactly.
Right.
And you had another group.
Right.
And you have your own experience with other groups, and I think that's one of the key elements that may explain the issue you were talking about right now. What can you feel?
I completely agree, and one of the things that I am kind of proud of at Adept Play is that you can see this precise process at work. You can see it at work in the Sorcerer game that I have posted about, the one about the music, and you can also see it in our RuneQuest game. In both cases, we had people playing together who may have known each other in pairs, some of them, but had never played with this game and this group before. And you can see us learning each other's range. You can see us bring different things and different standards. And what's successful about both games is that each one generates a unique way to play, a unique set of interactions relative to the rules, and then if we are talking about the fiction, we actually generate a plot that is emphatically not present before we began. So these are pretty good examples. Now, I want to focus on a couple of things about the jazz analogy which work really, really well for me. One of them is, and this is the big one, is there is such a thing as a satisfying set, a great set. And even if the set doesn't fail, it can still just be adequate. It is only adequate. And to people putting in, playing jazz is work. It is brain work, it is body work, it is really hard work. Nobody wants just an adequate set. So good enough is not good enough. So what is it that the actual music has that is better than just good enough? When does that, what is the, and I'm talking about the quality of the sounds. And every musician, I have a background in music as well. Every musician for every kind of music says exactly the same thing. When they feel it in each other and when they feel it from the audience. And although they are not playing strictly to please the audience, particularly in freeform jazz, the audience's response is part of the process. And it is important that the audience become engaged. And it is important, of course, for us to engage with each other. So, but what is it about the sounds that are produced that facilitate that? And I think that's an incredibly important question that musicologists can address. For our purposes in role-playing, we are talking about familiar things like characterization, plot, and things like that. But you cannot put characterization and plot in. These are things that come out. So I'm very interested in when characterization, plot, whatever, lets us know that this is great, this is working. We can look at each other's faces to some extent, but much more importantly, and this is exactly like the music, it's not just looking at the face of the bass player who likes what you just did. It's what does the bass player do now because of that. It's no good for him just to nod and say, hey, that was good. You need to feel it returns to you by what they contribute next. The analogy in role-playing in terms of fictional content is perfect.
Yeah,
it is
true.
exactly the same.
You could, in terms of emotions, you could just play the song or you could just play the system, but actually it's not the goal.
Right,
You're not
of
playing
course not.
the RPG to play rightly the system.
Exactly.
Generally, and you describe it very well when you say in your interview, I don't remember exactly what you said, you just say you try to do something and there's nothing in D&D that helps you to do that. And it's
for a
very
particular thing, yes, it may help do some other things, but it's not going to do that.
Exactly,
Yes. Mm.
exactly, but not that.
Mhm.
And when you arrive to do it, you cheated the system.
Mhm.
So to achieve your goal, some of RPG, well, you have to cheat the system. It only helps you when you cheat it. And it's very interesting because in my own experience, well, we always cheated with the system actually.
Well, that led to the common phrase that system doesn't matter. Because the systems,
true.
when people encountered systems that did not help them in their goals,
exactly,
they would ignore pieces of it, or they would realize, rightly, that they were doing something else.
Yeah,
Now,
and in the community I was, I mean, nobody knew, nobody even read the book until the end. Like, you read a book and you say, I got a cool idea, then you shut down the book and you play.
Right.
So even that, that partial knowledge, we have the same comparison with jazz here. You have a partial knowledge of the game and you just bring it.
Mm-hmm.
And the system doesn't matter because of what you said, because it just doesn't help you to do what you do.
Now,
what you want to do.
The negative side of this, from my experience, is when you do start designing systems with these other goals and other aesthetics in mind, sometimes when people encounter them, they cannot realize that they are looking at that. They have only ever encountered this other thing, so even in their own minds, they're looking at the page, but they are not reading the words. And they don't see that this system actually does do this other thing. And there are I've had multiple experiences of this. Well, here's the other aspect of jazz that I wanted to think about as an analogy. And that is the element of surprise. Playing jazz in my experience. And role-playing, if everybody at the table does precisely what you anticipated that they would do and knew that they would do, and you could, if you wanted to, say, okay, now I am comfortable, there will be no surprise. I will not have to adapt my behavior. I will not have to work with something that was unknown but now is known. And if I do, well, it's the kind of thing I knew I would know anyway. So that's okay. So you go into the table, this is theoretical or hypothetical, and you sit down and everything's fine. You are settled. You are ready to do it. And you are comfortable because you are going to be in a safe place where there will be no surprise about what that other person might do. They are not going to reverse something on you. They are not going to suddenly speed up or slow down. They are not going to change the tone. They are not going to, in fictional terms, they are not going to challenge the themes that we are all comfortable with doing. Analogize that to jazz. Would you want to play in a group like that for freeform jazz? I would never want to play. That's terrible. That's terrible. I want the bass player to change up on us right at the point in this familiar song, to change the signature, and all of us suddenly, and this is the bass player, you can't ignore the bass player, right? Forget it. That's, all of us suddenly have to look at each other and realize this is still the same song, but its foundation is now completely changed. Can we keep playing the same song with a completely different foundation, which will change everything about the way we play it from now on? And it's not just technical. We didn't just change the key. We are playing the reverse of the song now, in some way. We have turned it upside down. And jazz musicians use exactly that terminology, don't they? Yeah, man, and then he changed it. He turned it upside down. Or inside out. We are playing, we are playing this song that everybody knows. And then, did you see, it was so great when the bass player turned it inside out. And one guy says, yeah, I almost lost it. And they're all happy because they didn't lose it. But they sure as hell didn't play the song that they were expecting. And the bass player's all pleased. See what I did? See what I made you do? Right.
Yeah, and they share chords. I mean, it's inside the system itself.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Exactly. And that is...
You're not playing the rules. You're playing with the rules because you share it.
Well, the word rules becomes a different thing. That's why the word rules and system they're not quite the same thing. So, therefore, I think that is a key factor in role-playing as well, particularly when we are talking about fiction. Because if the goal for me is to sit down and write a story that makes my editor and my producer and my agent and the publicist completely happy, because they know it's exactly like the story that I wrote last time that everybody loved and they made a lot of money, they want me to do that again. Do that again. Write me another one of those. How many times has an author disappointed their editor, their producer, their agent, and their publicist with their next book? Because they don't get what he did before, or she. They don't get it. In fact, they're quite upset. And I think it's one of the biggest problems in the commodification of fiction, that the tension between those two effects is so high. And you can see famous author after famous author become despondent and depressed under the pressure to do that again and the fact that the creative process doesn't really like doing that again. And so you get, the long history of Hollywood drunks. And I could mention a very famous example, one of the most favorite modern authors, Stephen King, who, in my opinion, a great deal of the work is a cry for help to save him from writing The Shining again. When he's forced over and over and over again, write that again, do that again. And you can see it in various forms. Books that are rebellions, books that are bad, bad imitations of himself. Books that are padded, the same thing, but just padded 5 times longer. Stories that are complete breakdowns, complete meltdowns over this. And then long periods where he's not producing, and then later admits that he had been, completely drunk most of the time and running around signing books and pretending that maybe one day he would write one again, but the thought of writing one again was the worst thing he could possibly imagine. That's just one example. I'm picking him because he's considered one of the most successful modern writers.
It's a good example, but I just read an interview of him, actually, and he was telling something that's very interesting that you bring this into this discussion, because he was telling, don't write a story when you write a book. Never write a story. I never write a story. I just put the character, a disturbing element, and then follow the characters.
But you see, that's the same. That's a matter of, I'm not going to say it's just semantics. I'm going to say that the very term "write a story" has been polluted by the commodification of product.
Yeah.
And so, therefore, he's always been told to write a story, but to say that means do what you did last time.
Yeah.
So he has to lose that terminology completely in order to write a story.
Of course it is. That's what you said.
So to me, think of the character and flow from there. It's admitting that you don't have one, but you are now going to make one, which is good. You should admit that. Otherwise, you are simply going to transcribe this shit that is already existing. Why would you do that?
Yeah, we already played it.
Yeah.
Actually, we all played one.
Right. And so I think that the analogy is perfect. Yeah, but the difficulty with the terminology applies to role-playing very strongly. Because as soon as I started using the word story in the late 1990s, 20 years ago, it was rejected with rage.
Yeah, you told it in your...
Yeah, because they were in the position of Stephen King. They had always been told that write a story, make a story, means to accept what is already there and then to play it out mechanically. And of course they don't want to do that, or at least a number of the people in question don't want to do that. And I sympathize with them, but they think I'm the enemy because I used the word. So it took a long time to get people. It was like fighting a horse, you had to really redirect the entire situation so that they were even looking in the right direction. So let's take that to jazz, though. This is where role players, or some of us, envy the freeform jazz artist. They don't have that problem. They have a word. They have a word for what they're doing. And I suppose you could say freeform jazz. I don't know if anyone calls themselves that, but maybe they just say real jazz or something like that. But the point is that they have all agreed when they go in, they know that the final version or the produced version isn't going to already exist by agreement. They know it. They have got over this whole problem. And yet, I am envious. I want to be working with people. Now, this does happen. Those two groups I just mentioned and others, most of my role-playing now, is okay with this. But, unlike jazz, when you sit down with a group of people you don't know, a number of people may not have understood that. And so we are not at a developed point of cultural discussion. And remember, the jazz musicians did not need some external person to come in and explain this to them. They got over that problem or never had that problem already. So in role-playing, if we are talking about goals of this kind, we are handicapped. We are working with some terms like that awful word story. I mean, remember, you struggled in this conversation. You struggled with the word song. And you used it a few times at first, and then you abandoned it. You said, you know what, we are not really talking about songs. And you're right, we are not. For the same reason.
Yeah, I think you're really right. It's you have this important moment when you play, which is the debriefing that we never speak about. But it's like one of the most important features of our hobby, I think. Every time I play, I think we discuss more about the game than we play itself. I mean, yeah, between the sessions, not together, not all together, but with one and with another. And one of the main topics of this discussion, the briefing of the session, is always finding words. Like, but I couldn't in French we say impersonifier, like in-characterize. Mm-hmm. I didn't in-characterize. What did you mean by in-characterize?
No, well, it's true, yeah. But the word we say in character in English, and then also a very problematic word in role playing is the word immersion.
True.
And
because it doesn't.
Well,
it's not the same for everyone.
Correct. That's the biggest problem. The other interesting point is, and this applies to the jazz, and it applies to this role playing. Are we talking about what you put in, or are you talking about what happens when you are doing it? And in my experience, that state in which I drive forward in role-playing with precisely what the character I am playing does, and there was very little reflection at all. And I certainly didn't ask for anybody's opinion. And it's not necessarily right there on my character's sheet. It might be or it might not. But whatever it is, I drive forward with a great deal of certainty. It is those moments that analogize to the single author being sure, okay, yes, this guy did the killing and that person finds out later. I know, okay, that I've got. Now I'm going to make up this other part. Or they start furiously writing it. They turn it into medium now that they are sure. Every single author will tell you the same. Those moments are highly intuitive and nonverbal. I think it's the same in role-playing. But to say that you're going to start by doing that is ridiculous. You can't be in the process by which that occurs like that. I'm just going to flip it on and I will be right there sure with what the character does. No considerations at all. No, there's processing involved before you do that. And so that's what I'm getting at, that this experience of immersion or the production of plot or whatever it is we want to call it. And it is very interactive. We see how the people around us respond, and then they respond, just like I was talking about. When that occurs, it's not what you do to make it work, it occurs because it's working.
Yeah, generally you don't know what happened.
Right.
I mean, in my experience, because I'm some of my players and myself, that's what we are looking into in the RPG session.
Sure.
This moment when you don't know what your character will do.
Well, that's what I drive toward all the time. My game Sorcerer is completely predicated on that and nothing else.
Yeah, and
that's
really,
yeah.
Well, I think no system can help to facilitate this, but you're right. You don't know when it happens, but when it happens, when you're constantly playing to achieve this goal, and when it happens, you're like, yeah, I got it.
Well, there's also systematic and structural features that are going to work against it. Let's say,
Yeah, true.
that
Yeah.
a number of publicists have made a plan. They're going to go and they're going to find this musician. They're going to find that musician. They're going to find this place to play.
Mhm.
They're going to set the time. They are going to advertise and tell everybody how great it will be that we get these exact musicians together.
Mhm.
They're going to come up with the songs. They've chosen which songs the audience will like. And then they call the musicians and say, okay, this is what we are going to do. You tell me if that is the right structural and systematic procedure for having a great set.
No, of course.
No, it's terrible.
Generally, it doesn't
Yeah.
happen like.
So that's what I'm trying to say, is that although the system cannot make it happen, you can
Can-
play with the right system or the wrong system.
Yeah, not really.
Right. So that's very interesting. Tell me, you're playing the Sorcerer game, or you have been a little bit anyway, right?
Yeah.
How's that going?
Really, really nice. So it's a very interesting game because just a little background. So I play since I'm 10 years old. So my first game. Well, I was reading these books where this RPG book. How do you call it in English? Like the books you are the sole hero. You know.
Choose your own adventure.
Choose your own.
Right.
That's right. So, and I found this guy was reading this kind of books in the primary school, and we were like, "Oh, great, you're reading this," and we were changing it. Then he bought this red box from D&D, and we played only one time.
Mm-hmm.
We played only one time. Then he bought the second book, the ADD, Advanced D&D, and we played only one time. Okay. Then we had this shop always, and went to the shop and he bought Cthulhu, Call of Cthulhu. It was the 4th edition, and we were, I think, 10 years old at that moment, 10 or 11 years old, and he made a campaign. We played 5 years with the same characters, and the first time we arrived, we were 16. The first time we arrived in RPG clubs, it was like a shock.
Yeah. Who are these
Like-
people?
Like what the hell? So we played a D&D game and we were like shocked. Like we tried to RP, we couldn't. I mean, the story was pre-written. I was like in character and roll the dice and we were totally shocked by it. It's very interesting. And I started GMing 5 years ago. I was GMing mostly what? The new Chronicle of Darkness. Well, you can really feel right now that I have all this RPG, that your work and Wilson Baker's work and most of the story game authors and the Forge has deeply
Yeah.
affected
Mhm.
game design. You can feel it. Still, there's problem, but there's an evolution.
Well, I don't expect the entire hobby to simply follow my
No.
lead, but I definitely agree with you that both explicit and implicit changes have occurred through a very wide range. In fact, if you even look at the different iterations of the World of Darkness,
Yeah.
you can see, and I'm not saying I influenced that necessarily, but I am saying that you can see really big differences in the creative teams in terms
Yeah.
of what they thought was important. That's very clear. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it was, well, I don't remember how it happened, but I played this game. So I mastered this game 5 years ago. That was my first experience as a GM. I had some, but it didn't work. And my experience was that I was too stressed, so I needed a pre-plan. So you're over-planning, and that's one of the, the child sickness of the GM. I think you're stressed and you're over-planning.
I know, I will control it. That will solve everything.
Yeah, true. And that's where Sorcerer and Apocalypse World, but I think most Sorcerer right now that I'm playing, solved all of my problems.
Ah.
Not all of the problems of RPG, my problems.
Right, they well met your needs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And where was it? So yeah, with the what one of the key elements, for instance, a failure is not a failure. I mean, you can fail, but your character is not ridiculous.
Right, that's one of that's an aesthetic. Yeah,
good.
Yeah, there is.
And I've read this in Sorcerer and Sword, actually.
Right.
So the second key element was really striking for me. So you have a good system, it works, but then you have a combat system. And when you get to the combat, and you can see this in the evolution of the system in World of Darkness, like they improve the game, they improve the system, but still you come to a turn by turn, and the combat stays like half an hour, but you're not playing combat, you're playing an investigative game, so.
Yeah,
So
working on champions right now is a very interesting process for me.
Mm-hmm.
Champions' roots are in skirmish fighting, and so in my experience, that can become extremely productive in what is basically a very loud soap opera.
Mm.
Fortunately, if you read comics by creators who felt the same way, there are lots of ways for detailed, decision-filled combat actually to work toward those ends. But it's a very specific design goal to make that happen. You can't just make a combat system and expect that to happen.
Yeah.
So most people, many people have referred to role-playing combat mechanics as the game within the game for a reason.
True.
Yeah.
That's how I felt it.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting to see that which I was GMing 5 years ago, you could solve a conflict, not a task. All this task versus conflict.
Yes, please don't make me relive those 10 years of discussion.
No, I don't know, but I just want to say that it was really relieving for me. Like, I can.
You'll see in a little while. I will post a discussion that I had just had a few days ago with Jonathan Tweet, the author of Over the Edge.
Yeah.
And he and I talked about game mechanics in that exact context.
Okay.
So you will enjoy that discussion. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, so this little discovery made us make RPG again. Like we weren't playing anymore.
Right.
Or nobody wanted to GM. I mean, it's too long. We're busy. It's too much work.
Role-playing is full. Role-playing, being a great game master in role-playing is unfortunately too much like being a graduate student. The entire culture is littered with bitter dropouts. So.
Yeah, you never finish a campaign.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's oh god, the analogy is horrible.
So that's where I come from, and I remember. I passed night and night to read old Forum of the Forge, and I was like, wow, this crazy idea. But I wasn't reading a game.
Right.
I just read this discussion, and that affected my way of GMing. And then we had this idea where, Apocalypse World is like a big thing in the...
Yes, of course. Right.
So we wanted to try it. And I took it, and it's very, it's very different.
Well, the way you've written about it is clear. I mean, that was your door opening.
Yeah, that was the door. Mm-hmm. Really. We tried the pool before, but the real door was.
The analogy has been made before, but this was a very useful way to look at. Let's go back to that outsiders feature, though.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go back to that. I'm sure, I need to read the book now, but I'm sure that the nature of jazz players relative to the larger society, it's not a surprise that these musical innovations, and particularly the aspects of freedom and your own agency, your own presence in this. I am playing tonight, and you're going to know that it was me or us. Those elements and the context in it are actually a little bit difficult to understand for role-playing. One might romanticize being a geek and say, oh yeah, we were like the jazz players. You know, I don't think we were like the jazz players. I think jazz players were a lot more outsiders than we were.
Of course.
And I also think that there is another element in the United States which is very difficult and interesting to understand. I don't think I fully understand it. I want somebody to study this. If you wanted to rebel in the United States, if you wanted to be a teenager who was thinking creatively differently from any of the standard ways that were available to you, if you wanted to do that, what do you do? And there is this sort of extreme form where you have a huge breakup with your family and you become a tattoo artist and perhaps a methamphetamine addict who, you know, does tattoos for motorcycle gangs and stuff like that. You know, you could be, I mean, you want to talk about being an outsider, you can be an outsider and pay all the prices that the outsider pays. What was the role player? Many of whom had aspects of that, not in my generation, but just afterward. Throughout most of the 1980s, most parents discouraged their children from role-playing because if in the religious communities it was considered to be magic and the devil, but much more widely in less religious communities, progressive communities, it was considered bad for the child. It was bad for them. There was something wrong with it, psychologically. And your child would be damaged, or your child would at the very least waste their time when they could be getting ready for college. So, you know, something's wrong with it. And so there is also the countercultural elements of the origin of role-playing that most people don't know about. Its origins in outsider aspects of culture. The underground comics, the many other things I have written about. So in some ways, it is its own kind of twilight outsider culture that has not been analyzed carefully. For myself, that part of what attracts me about role-playing and why don't I just go and become a writer? Why don't I do it right? Why don't I make some fucking money? Why don't you do this like a proper creative person?
I've heard that.
Right. Why don't you do it the right way? You know, why do you have to do it in a way that by definition is not going to gain respect in the first place for doing it at all? Even a tattoo artist. And I mean, I'm not talking about somebody with a nice shop downtown. I'm talking about like somebody in their garage where the motorcycle guys come. Even everybody else, they may disapprove of that person and say they're wasting their life, but they're going to say they kind of understand that people want the tattoos. Somebody's going to be doing that. You just don't want your kid to be doing that. Role-playing doesn't even have that, right?
No.
It's like, what on earth do you think you're doing? And I have always enjoyed the immense procedural freedom that gives me. It's one of the reasons why I resist the notion of procedural standards or acceptable methods of play, acceptable procedures of play, the way we know it should be. the idea that there is an ideological or procedural gold standard for play that we all know what it is. I've always resisted that because it is precisely the procedural freedom that has attracted me. Now, does that just mean I am stubborn? Or better? A loser? Now, be careful how a person needs to be careful how they answer that. You could reject it and say, no, any minute now role-playing is going to be, famous and everybody will respect it. Actors do it now. Famous actors do it. People are going to like it. It will be okay. We were just early adopters. We're not losers. We were ahead. That's one answer. The other answer could be, no, that's just all the other role players. I'm actually not a loser. Right? I'm one of the good ones. Another one is to say, yes, and I think you can analogize those to people in jazz too. All of those three things. Those three responses. So it's not the same kind of outsider culture, but aspects of it are similar enough that those kinds of responses are similar.
Yeah, so there's two different topics here. No, there's a lot more. But
Well, I was going to say, yeah, we might have opened a few boxes here.
You can see two. So you have I'm taking back the analogy on jazz. You have jazz as an outsider practice, and you have jazz as a creative as a social collective creation, live creation of a repertoire, of a cultural instance. So there's a discussion, and I don't think right now in the definition of what is deviant, what is an outsider. I don't think RPG culture now is outsider because it could have been, and you described that it has been mostly in USA. I think
you're right.
In Belgium, we had a debate.
Right. Are role players motorcyclists, methamphetamine addicts, or are they just people who like to build model airplanes?
Yeah, really. But it's not the practice of RPG, because being an outsider is a career. You have skills. You have steps.
Right.
When you smoke, take the example of drugs. When you smoke marijuana, you cannot smoke marijuana the first time. I mean, it's not good. Even just smoking, you cannot smoke. People get rid of you. Like, haha, you're not smoking. Taking the smoke in you're keeping the smoke in your mouth.
Right.
So there is a skill. You learn to smoke. Then you learn, and you have skills by step, like a class. Actually, I hate class in RPG. Like a class. At the second level, you learn to control the effects, so people don't know that you're high, And every step, so you have really a career. Every step you have skills, and I don't think.
Well, I can name a few other skills too. I mean, there's the skill of actually looking at what you've bought and seeing if it's any good, or assessing whether you want to pay that much for it.
Exactly.
There's the skill
to
of
find yourself, your product.
There's the skill actually of how one of the great skills, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? Or the skill of when someone else has the bong, of knowing how to apply the flame. Right?
And so it's a path.
Right.
Being an outsider, it's a path, and it's only a path because...
Or maybe I just know these things because I read about it once.
Yeah. Well, so you have a career in your being a jazz musician is a career, not in a professional sense. I mean, it's a metaphor.
Yes, and this is also the interaction with the precise ability to play the instrument too. I mean, they're not independent of each other, but they're not quite the same things.
No, totally. Yeah. So you have technical skills too.
Right.
And I think that's the difference. I mean, you're not marginalized because of practice of RPG right now. I don't think
Right.
it could have been at one moment. It's not the same kind of outsider. So this is one topic of discussion. I think it's interesting as you called it, but it's more something a historical.
Perhaps. I mean, after all, when I started the efforts that captured your attention, when you arrived and looked at all this ridiculous discussion and everything, this archive, when I began that, the idea of even studying role-playing games at a graduate academic level, you had maybe 2 examples in the entire history of the hobby at that point. Now, people are getting their PhDs in this. People are, people are being hired. People who brought their shitty little first try at a game to the Forge in 2001, they are now, taking they're in academia taking graduate students now.
Yeah,
So,
I was in a
yeah.
jury. I'm social worker,
Mhm.
and as I told you in the email, I was in a jury guy who used RPG in social work
Right.
to develop the skills you need, the social skills you need in social work.
Yeah. The interesting question, though, is still, what about the intangible respect that you get for a particular activity, whether it's work-related or not work-related? But even if somebody doesn't do it, they say, oh, I recognize that that is something a person could do if they want, and I'll respect it. If a person is not themselves and let's move into these leisure activities, a person is not themselves a dedicated snowboarder. But if you say, I design snowboards. Now, to this person, every snowboard is the same. You sit on it and you go down the hill. You stand on it and you go down the hill. Right? But you say, I design snowboards, and they say, well, I don't know very much about it, but that must be interesting. There must be some interesting variable. There must be a culture of snowboarders who are interested in different designs. There must be some kind of market about this. You could put up a website about your different snowboards, and people would be interested, some people would be interested in looking at it, and I can respect all of that. I don't do anything of the sort. Never been on a snowboard, but I get it. That sounds, and now what do I say? I say, hey, that sounds really interesting. And I'm not even going to pursue it. I'm not going to try to snowboard, but I respect that this person does that. Role-playing doesn't have that. So instead of being a victim and saying everybody is being unfair and picking on us, why can't they respect what I do? I don't care about that. I'm interested in it because in modern culture, to not receive that respect for something is a very, very, very strong disincentive. So I'm very interested in why people do it when they do. And so that is another whole discussion, and may have generational aspects for sure. So
Yeah, but
yeah.
if you bring, the way you bring it is very clear.
Yeah. Well, Henri, I think I have to go.
Yeah.
But this was a wonderful discussion. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. So, I would like to tell you, not now, but about the sorcery game, because it's very interesting.
Absolutely, absolutely. We could do it in a discussion like this, or
Yeah,
you
it
could.
would be great.
Yeah,
because
let's do that.
it's-
I'm playtesting my design for a company now, and it's called Cosmic Zap. And I have been posting some of the sessions, and I'm finally starting to get caught up in the sessions. And I think you will like that very much, because that design right now is closest to jazz of any design I have done.
Right.
Yeah. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Goodbye.